The title of this evening's session is China and Global Security, and you will see in the mock-up of the Chinese flag there the face of President Trump, who will loom large in this presentation later, and who made some fairly incendiary comments about China in a speech at the White House yesterday evening. But we're going to go back in time a little bit first to try and provide the historical context for where we are in the current situation in 2020 with China and global security. So the Chinese the modern Chinese story really starts with the Communist Revolution in 1949, led by Mao Zedong, and this was a revolutionary movement that harnessed the population of working class people, mainly from the countryside, and it was a revolution of people who were determined um, to make China a more equal place and to remove some of the power of the traditional elites in China. And so, yeah, so the Communist Revolution in China, the post Second World War growth of communism, is part of the story of the Cold War, and it it worried the Americans at the time that China had become a communist state, but at the same time, as the Cold War developed in the mid to late 20th century, um, the uneasy relationship between the two major communist powers of the world, China and Russia, provided the United States with some interesting geopolitical maneuvers that they could make um, to their advantage. And the next part of the story, really, in a very whistle stop tour of Chinese history, is the Cultural Revolution of 1966, roundabout then to 1976. There was a feeling at this time that the traditional or the pure ideas of the Communist Revolution had been lost, and so Mao called on the nation's youth to purge the impure elements of Chinese society and to revive the revolutionary spirit. Now, as part of this cultural revolution, um, possibly as many as 1.5 million people were killed, and certainly millions more were imprisoned and tortured. So this revolutionary movement, which was hailed as a sort of renaissance or a rebirth of the Communist Party in China, was actually a pretty brutal affair throughout the 60s and into the 70s. And what it left in its wake by the time we get to the 1980s were a group of educated and, in many cases, middle class, although that was a relative term in the 1980s in China if we're applying it um, to international comparison. They were calling for reforms. They wanted to try and unlock the Chinese economy. They wanted more private investment. They wanted to be able to make more money, essentially. They wanted to be able to use their education and their innovation to be able to prosper and to improve their position economically. And alongside that desire to improve China economically and maybe to move to more private enterprise and away from state-controlled economic models, political freedom that would come along that maybe there would be more opportunity for Chinese people to have freedom of speech and to be able to speak against policies that they disagreed with. However, the Chinese president at the time, Deng Xiaoping, and some hardliners in the Communist Party responded in a particularly repressive way to this attempt by to get reform from the Communist Party. And the most obvious expression of this came in the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. Tiananmen Square, again, now several years on, still incredibly controversial in Chinese history. And if you try and search for Tiananmen Square in any sort of Google search or any sort of internet search in any part of China, you will simply not find out anything about the Tiananmen Square massacre. This is quite a groundbreaking BBC report from the time, from the BBC's Chinese correspondent at the time, Kate Adie, and it really does the sense of shock that the Chinese people felt at how repressive the government was.
The noise of gunfire rose from all over the center of Peking. It was unremitting. On the streets leading down to the main road to Tiananmen Square, furious people stared in disbelief at the glow in the sky, listening to the sound of shots. Heading down the road was a hazardous business, but hundreds of people cheered as buses were set alight and army trucks caught fire too. They yelled and shouted, and then as troop lorries were seen moving down the road, there was gunfire from those lorries.
The troops have been firing indiscriminately, but still there are thousands of people on the streets who will not move back.
The bicycle rickshaws scooped up the injured. Others were shunted onto bikes and pedaled to hospital. Many were carried away by frantic local residents. There was confusion and despair among those who could hardly credit that their own army was firing wildly at them. Many were bystanders, perhaps naive about the savagery of the situation. Indeed, it was hard at times to grasp that this army was launching into an unarmed civilian population as if charging into battle. From Tiananmen Square, the sound of gunfire sounded like a battle, but it was one-sided. A line of soldiers was strung out, facing a huge crowd. The air was filled with shouts of "Fascists! Stop killing!" We were in the line facing the troops. They were about 250 yards away. Young people were singing the Internationale to a background of gunfire.
After hours of shooting and facing a line of troops, the crowd is still here. They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government."
A huge volley of shots just as I left the front line caused panic. The young man in front of me fell dead. I fell over him. 2 others were killed yards away. 2 more people lay wounded on the ground near me. Ambulances screamed up to the troop line and were turned away. They couldn't get to the square. 2 ambulance drivers were shot and injured. Earlier, we'd been driving at the back of the Forbidden City, the old part of Peking, near the square. We picked up a woman with a bullet in the head and took her to the nearby children's hospital, into a scene of near mayhem. Casualties were arriving every few seconds, on bikes, rickshaws, park benches, carried in, all with gunshot wounds. Housewives, elderly residents, people shot while sitting in their homes. The operating theatre was overflowing, many of the staff in tears. In 20 minutes, 40 seriously injured were brought for emergency surgery. 2 were already dead. In the streets, many came up to us, shaking with anger and disbelief and fear. Many were terrified, saying there would be retribution. There was not one voice on the streets which did not express despair and rage.
So that report at the time, as you can imagine, because it's incredibly graphic, it's incredibly in the moment. The reporter herself is there as people are being killed and injured. She is a real actor in that drama rather than just somebody reporting from the fringes of it. That had a massive impact around the world, and so did this image that came to symbolize the whole of the Tiananmen Square massacre and the protests that led up to it. This guy, simply known as Tank Man, because nobody knows what his actual name is. Nobody knows if he's still alive, if he was detained by the authorities, but he essentially stood in front of a line of 4 military vehicles, 4 tanks, and he would not move. And he stood there and he gesticulated at the tank driver, and he seemed to be protesting and shouting at him until some passers-by, or possibly some members of the security force, or possibly just some ordinary members of the public, came and ushered him away from in front of the tank. And this image and this unknown individual became an icon of this era, and it really sent shockwaves around the world, and it also challenged the Chinese government to think about what their response was going to be. The whole world had seen the massacre of people in Tiananmen Square, and that was the visual and public repression of the attempts to achieve reform. There was much more brutal repression that people did not see. And so the Chinese government, essentially, Deng Xiaoping and the Communist Party, made a decision. And we can see this episode in 1989 as really the foundation, the starting point from where China is now in 2020 in terms of its global position.
If Tank Man has survived, where is he now? Since the day he made his heroic stand, his country has changed beyond recognition. Old economic dogmas were cast aside. To attract foreign capital, China's leaders created special economic zones and removed many restrictions on foreign ownership and investment. The results were dramatic. 15 years ago, this entire skyline didn't exist, just paddy fields. China's rise is the story of the 21st century, and it is rooted in the events of 1989.
This was Deng Xiaoping's great moment of genius. After the massacre of 1989, he in effect said, we will not stop economic reform. We will, in effect, halt political reform. What he basically said to people was, folks, you're in a room. There are two doors. One door says politics, one door says economics. You open the economic door, you're on your own, you can go the full distance, do basically whatever you want, get wealthy, help your family, have a bright future, move forward into a glorious future. You open the political door, you're going to run right into one obstruction after another, and you're going to run into the state.
There was a point to that. This was meant to buy the Communist Party a new lease on life. On the one hand, intimidate opposition for a generation. On the other hand, give the people bread and circuses. And the deal is there must be no challenge to one-party rule. That's the terms of today's China. That's the deal.
And that deal, as was described there, has worked out incredibly well for the Chinese economy. If you see this graphic here, this shows the share of the world economy of different countries, and you can see China there with a 15.4% share of the world economy is the next biggest economic power next to the United States. And really, if you look at that graphic, the only other single country that comes anywhere close to China and the United States is Japan on 6%. Everybody else is nowhere near the United States and China. So those two countries make up over 40%. This graphic was from 2017, so by 2020 they comfortably make up over 40% of the world economy. So that decision in 1989 to open up economic reform for China and to move beyond a traditional communist economic model has been hugely successful for the Chinese economy. Here we see that China is the world's manufacturing superpower. These figures are from 2018. China is streets ahead of any other country in the world. It is not far short of double the manufacturing power that the United States is. You just think about all the products that are in your homes, say made in China. The Chinese are undoubtedly the major manufacturing power of the world, and this graphic is interesting in terms of the United States relationship with China that we're going to come to in a moment. This is the foreign countries, the foreign banks and foreign businesses that own US national debt. So when the US borrows money in order to fund projects, they borrow it from on international markets, they borrow it from finance capital firms and banks in other countries, and China is the major holder of US national debt alongside Japan, and those two countries dwarf any other country in terms of their significance in owning US national debt. So we have in China a situation where political reform is, or any attempt to call for political reform, is stamped upon by the one-party communist state. Amnesty International in 2019 said the human rights situation continued to be marked by a systematic crackdown on dissent. China does not make public the number of people in the country who are punished with the death penalty. The Amnesty International has produced reports yearly on the treatment of minorities in China and on the political repression that exists in China. So we have this dichotomy, this paradox, we have this contrast in the position of China in 2020, which the roots of that were in 1989 after the Tiananmen Square massacre, where we have an economic superpower. We have a huge global reach economically, and we have the ability for people in China to make an incredible amount of money and to invest it and to bring riches to the Chinese economy. But the price that they pay for that freedom is that they have no political freedom, and that the one-party state, the Communist Party, runs a pretty repressive regime. Now, brings us on to the current global pandemic. This is Dr. Lai, the picture here, who was the doctor in Wuhan who discovered the coronavirus, if you like, and wrote about how it was a new type of disease and raised the alarm of how destructive this virus could be. He was summoned by the authorities, and he was forced to sign a document. The document said, "We solemnly warn you, if you keep being stubborn with such impertinence and continue this illegal activity, you will be brought to justice. Is that understood?" And underneath, in Dr. Lai's handwriting, is written, "Yes, I do." And Dr. Lai tragically died. He was dealing with some of the first patients to suffer with coronavirus, probably was exposed to an incredible viral load, and even though he was a young and relatively young, in his 30s, fit, healthy man, he died of COVID-19. And this obviously has raised suspicion, even if people are not going to buy into the sort of Wuhan biological chemical factory and the leak of COVID-19, which there isn't any scientific evidence to suggest that this virus is man-made. Even if you look beyond that, there is a lot of distrust of China for the way they maybe tried to cover up this outbreak, and the way in which that cover-up and that failure to alert the world to this earlier may have caused the extent of the global pandemic, or certainly might have been a contributing factor. And Trump who likes to score lots of political points by criticizing the Chinese, has of course called coronavirus the Chinese flu, and has used the pandemic and used the Chinese origins of it as part of his very high risk geopolitical games with the Chinese, and the Chinese are obviously none too impressed with this.
中方坚决反对任何利用病毒溯源问题搞污名化的做法。我们注意到，美国国内各界已有不少有识之士公开谴责利用疫情搞污名化、发表种族主义的做法。
Now, at the same time as this is going on, at the same time that Trump is stirring up conflict with the Chinese over the origins of COVID-19, there is also increasing protest in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a British colony, was a British protectorate, and the British signed a lease to keep hold of Hong Kong for 100 years. They signed that in the late 19th century, and in 1997 they handed over Hong Kong back to the Chinese. Now, the deal was at that point, because Hong Kong had developed in a very different way to the rest of China, the idea was that, and the motto was, China said that there would be one country, two systems. So in other words, Hong Kong would be part of China, part of that country, but they would respect that there were greater political freedoms and different economic models in Hong Kong. And what we actually see happening over the last 2 or 3 years in Hong Kong is the Chinese effort to exert the same level of political control and to squash dissent in the same way as they do in mainland China in Hong Kong also. And this has caused tension with the British, and this has caused tension with the United States. And only last night, Donald Trump made a speech outside the White House in which he said that he was going to revoke any special trading status that Hong Kong had, because as far as he was concerned, it was being run just like the rest of China. And he warned about this last week in a speech that he made. And again, this has caused many in the Chinese government to become increasingly anxious and annoyed, and to become increasingly frustrated with the Americans. The Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, fraught with emotions and whims and McCarthyist bigotry. That's what US policy was towards China. It seems as if every Chinese investment is politically driven, every Chinese student is a spy, and every cooperation initiative is a scheme with a hidden agenda. The Trump administration has expelled a number of Chinese diplomats. It has deemed 4 Chinese news agencies as foreign espionage agencies. The Chinese have responded by expelling members of the United States press corps, including members of the Wall Street Journal, from China, and there's an escalation in the tension between the two countries.
China has replaced its promised formula of one country, two systems with one country, one system. Therefore, I am directing my administration to begin the process of eliminating policy exemptions that give Hong Kong different and special treatment. My announcement today will affect the full range of agreements we have with Hong Kong, from our extradition treaty to our export controls on dual-use technologies and more, with few exceptions. We will be revising the State Department's travel advisory for Hong Kong to reflect the increased danger of surveillance and punishment by the Chinese state security apparatus. We will take action to revoke Hong Kong's preferential treatment as a separate customs and travel territory from the rest of China.
And it's not just the Americans that are wary of the relationship with the Chinese. It's not just the Americans that are pushing back against it. In 2009, the Swedish car manufacturer Volvo signed a takeover deal with a Chinese company to help to bail them out of some financial problems. However, they are increasingly frustrated with this deal, and they are increasingly frustrated with the control that the Chinese company has over Volvo and other Swedish companies that have been bought out or invested in by Chinese companies, are having to share technologies with these companies, and in some of these cases, some of the dual technologies are then being shared with the Chinese military, and there's a large movement in the Swedish government to try and distance themselves from these relationships with the Chinese government via Chinese companies. And of course, in this country, in this week, the government has made a dramatic U-turn on the place of Huawei's place in the construction of Britain's 5G network, and they have said that Huawei is not going to be able to take part in that. That has caused incredible anger amongst the Chinese. Boris Johnson's been advised by the Defence Select Committee and also by MI6 that actually the Chinese could be spying on Britain. The British government has been put under a lot of pressure by the American government to try and scupper this deal, because they feel as though the Chinese will use this telecommunications network to spy on Western powers. So there's increasing distrust at the Chinese, and there's increasing worry that Chinese, their economic model, is one that is going to lead to more and more attempts by the Chinese to involve themselves in the politics of other countries, and that they are being an aggressive policy of trying to expand their own economy and to expand their own ideas of political systems at the expense of the countries that they are investing in. And as possibly teenagers who are interested in TikTok videos, this is even being linked to a potential Chinese effort to steal our data and to spy on us in various different countries.
800 million of us have downloaded TikTok around the globe.
And plenty of governments are concerned about the role that a Chinese-owned app now plays in all of our lives. It's just been banned in India, the app's biggest overseas market, where it's considered to be a national security threat. But it's been banned and reinstated there before, same as in Bangladesh and Indonesia. A ban doesn't necessarily mean it's game over. There's also concern in Australia, the US and the UK as to whether TikTok's parent company ByteDance shares your data with the Chinese government. American Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has commended the ban and has said that banning the app in the US is something we're looking at.
US citizens' data that they have on their phones or in their system or in their healthcare records, we want to make sure that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have a way to easily access that.
A lot of how TikTok works, from its data storage to its algorithm, is shrouded in mystery. So what do we know? It says that its US data is stored in the US with backup in Singapore, and it's also said that it's recently moved its European privacy operations to Ireland. A ban in North America would be huge. It's big business for TikTok and is home to its biggest star, Charli D'Amelio, with 70 million followers. American activity is really important to its brand image as a video platform full of funny and educational content that can rival YouTube. So is TikTok trying to look, well, less Chinese? TikTok withdrew the app recently from Hong Kong alongside Google, Facebook and Twitter because of new Chinese national security laws that crack down on pro-democracy protesters. For TikTok, that was a big political move to demonstrate that it isn't tied to the Chinese government. But TikTok has repeatedly refused to appear at congressional hearings in the US to discuss security issues. If TikTok really did have nothing to hide, why does it still not have much to say?
And so that brings us to the end of the presentation, and we're going to consider really the position of China in the global economy and also in the global political structure.